Hello there folks, welcome back to the Chap's Guide. My name is Ash. I am your host on this journey through men's style, self-development and personal grooming. Now as you know, I'm staying up here in Oak Lodge. It is some festive material for you over this midpoint or Christmas period of the year, and I'm having some fireside chats in which I answer questions from you folks that you have delightfully sent in as the smoke wafts over me and keeps me nice and warm. But here we go. So today's question is from Daniel, who recently wrote to me with a question which really got me thinking and delving into, some thoughts that I've been having for a while. And that is, who would you like to see as the next embodiment of James Bond? Personally, I would like to see Henry Cavill take on the role. Cavill is a fantastic example of exemplary men's style. Well, I think many people might draw a comparison with your thinking there. I'll reserve my judgment to the end, but it is a great question. And of course, many fans of the Bond genre or the Bond character have been left in a sense of hiatus since Bond sort of bowed out in No Time to Die, and I think it was about 2021, so it was quite a while ago now, and there doesn't seem to be any movement forward in casting a new Bond, or if there has, it certainly hasn't leaked out to the public. Yes, Bond, or Daniel Craig, hung up his tuxedo quite a few years ago now, a couple of years ago at least, and after 15 years and 5 really rather successful movies in which he really moved along the dialogue about the character of James Bond, it'll be very interesting to see who comes next. But for a moment, let's talk about the legacy of Daniel Craig, because he really did shift the character along. I want to recognise that Dan did that, and when he was an unusual selection for Bond. I think people were wrong-footed when he was initially selected, because he was quite different to the previous characters who'd played him. The immediate past Bond, of course, was Pierce Brosnan, who was this very stylish, dark character, dark-haired character, who conformed to the sort of previous Bonds as well. He was over 6 feet tall. He was very sort of debonair. For most of us, we didn't see Daniel Craig in that light. For a start, he was shorter. He's about 5'10", 5'11". He's the shortest Bond, the only one who's under 6 feet in height up to this point. He was of lighter complexion, so sort of fairish hair, blue-eyed. He was more muscular. Physically, he played a much more visceral character of Bond, with bulging muscles, and his physicality was very much part of the role. So many people, we were a little bit uncertain when he first came along, and we didn't really know where the Bond character was going to go. What we did know was that Die Another Day, the last film by Pierce Brosnan, had been a little bit out there. If you cast your mind back, it was, sort of ice palaces, there were invisible Aston Martin cars, lasers. It was like something that was not like the Bond from the literary world. It had totally divorced itself from how I identified Bond, being a lover initially of the written Bond. So I was really hopeful that the new iteration of Bond would see something different. And we did get that, because what they did, the producers, Eon, they took Bond right back to the beginning. They didn't carry on. They took us and retold us the story of Bond becoming a 00 in his first movie, Daniel Craig, that was Casino Royale. It was a huge success, and it really projected forward then the direction that they were going to go in. Now, it's fair to say, Daniel Craig showed us a Bond that was very different to the previous. He was brutally tough and a monster. I think he was played more like the fictional or the literary character than any other screen actor that we've seen playing Bond other than Sean Connery. Connery played Bond very similar to the books, and I think we can see the sort of the handprint really of Ian Fleming in that, because of course we know that Ian Fleming didn't direct in the screen sense, but he was present in the first couple of Bond movies, and he played a part in the selection of Sean Connery for sure. So he had a hand on the beginnings of the screen Bond canon. Now we see Daniel Craig tearing it right back to that first sort of character, a government-sanctioned hitman. Over the years, it had deviated away from that. And if we look at the Roger Moore years, it was almost played tongue-in-cheek. He was some sort of debonair playboy spy rather than, a murderous secret agent who did the dirty work for his country. And Daniel Craig definitely took us back in that direction. To my mind, and this is just a personal observation, I always found Daniel Craig's personification of Bond to be a little dour and a little depressing. There never seemed to be a point in any of the Bond movies where we saw Daniel Craig playing that role where Bond took pleasure or joy in his life. He always seemed to be totally committed to his work, depressive, never happy, drinking heavily, quite often self-medicating to overcome perhaps the guilt of some of the things he had to do. We're left to presuppose that. But I never really got the impression that Daniel Craig got to grips with that element of Bond. A bon vivant, somebody who, was able to go into a gentleman's club in St. James's in London, play a few hands of bridge, enjoy caviar, know the vintages of champagne, yet step outside and, be the brutal killer that was necessary with his job. Daniel Craig only got half of that for me. He never was that debonair secret agent who, at the very least, took some joy out of his job or got any peace out of it. Even with Craig's portrayal of Bond, we saw him starting as an agent and dying, in the service of his country. And that seems to be the only piece which he got, was at the very end where he lost his life. So very interesting. When we talk about style, and you've mentioned style with Henry Cavill, of course it's kicked up a gear with the recent Bond, because we see product placement in all of the Bond movies now, the cars, the machinery, the watches, everything. And Daniel Craig definitely took it on a journey. Of course, he was dressed by the people who produced the film. He doesn't choose what clothes to wear, but they dressed him in a way which I think was quite stylish. We saw him taking the path of Tom Ford, American fashion designer really, and a model himself. So the suits were much more modern in style. They were much more close fitting to the body, which we had seen in the past. We'd seen a sort of Savile Row style previously. Now we were seeing a very modernist style. And many people, myself included, would say that the suits worn by Dan Craig were too tight. They were obviously cut very close to his physique because he was a strong, muscular-looking man, and they wanted to make the most of that on screen. I do not think his suits look comfortable, and they certainly didn't endear me into thinking, I want to go out and buy that sort of suit. Not at all. But when we see some of the other accessories, the shirts by Turnbull and Asser, great to see their association with Bond continuing. Even the cocktail cuff in a few of the films. N. Peel, the knitwear manufacturer. I walked past their shops in London many times. Fabulous knitwear. My wife has got one of their jumpers, and they are exquisite quality. Barber, he wore Barber in, I think, Skyfall. Catapulted that particular model into, global success. Sunspell, shirts, things like that. All of the items which he wore were curated very carefully from collections which are of the highest quality and very well manufactured. Omega wristwatches. All right, Omega obviously write a big check to the producers to get their timepieces in the movie. And in the last movie we saw, No Time to Die, I think he wore several different watches. You'd have to be on your A game to recognise them, but he kept changing watches. He was wearing, the Bond, the Seamaster, which had been made especially for the movie. We'd seen him wearing Aquaterra watch in a Fusi. It was really product placement to a fine style. And the cars, Aston Martin, back with Aston Martin, having gone through the BMW era with Pierce Brosnan, again, product placement. But Bond isn't really Bond without an Aston Martin, in my opinion. So it was great to see him back there. So that is something of the legacy which Dan Craig has left us, this sort of relationship with quality items and a different type of Bond. So, who next? That's the big question, isn't it? Let me just throw another log on here. Got to keep it going, keep it nice and warm. It's a little bit chilly today, and I'm not going to get cold. So, who next? That's the big question. It looks like the next Bond is obviously going to cut his teeth from a beginning point again, because, you know, Bond clearly died in the last movie. So, are we going to have just a brand new Bond starting from scratch, becoming a 00 again? Or are we just going to see him catapulted into the middle of a story and we take for granted the fact that he has been on that journey and now he's an established character? So that'll be interesting to see. Many names have been mentioned over the last, well, probably 10 years, because Daniel Craig made it very clear that this was going to be his last movie, No Time to Die. In fact, we weren't even sure he was going to come back for that. So lots of names have been bandied around. But I've got some fundamentals which I think need to be in place for a Bond character. Now, these for me are not negotiable, and you'll understand why I mean that, but he has to be certain things. First of all, he has to be British. All right, that's a given. All of the Bond characters so far have either been British or had a close association with Britain. You've had somebody from Scotland in Connery. You've had somebody from Wales in Tim Dalton. You've had George Lazenby, who was actually Australian, so an association with Britain. You have had Pierce Brosnan, who was from Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, so again, an association with Britain to a degree, but he's, you know, played the role as an Englishman quite well. But for me, it has to be a British character or a British role, an actor, or somebody closely associated. So Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, Canada perhaps, but the British accented character is very much part of the Bond. He is a British gentleman. So we can't diverge from that. You know, we couldn't have a Tom Cruise playing the character, I think, somebody who's associated predominantly with another country, but who's putting on a British accent. It wouldn't work. It would need to be a British character for me. So let's talk about gender and racial background, because we live in this super woke period, don't we, where, you know, every character that's coming up for renewal, there is no talk that why should they be a man? Perhaps they should be, you know, a female, or should be somebody from a different ethnic background. Well, I think with the Bond character, we have a strong body of work to draw from. We know what Ian Fleming was thinking because he's told us in the books. All right, so we know that Bond is a British, he's a man, and he is of white background. We know that because Fleming has said on record that when he was writing the books, he actually pictured in his mind David Niven visually, right? So he had this mental image of David Niven as looking like the James Bond as he was writing it, you know, his manuscripts. And in fact, funnily enough, you know, David Niven did play the character of James Bond in the original first ever Casino Royale. So yeah, he did get to do it, but we know for sure that this is not a Doctor Who situation where you can change the ethnic background or the gender of the main character, because there is flexibility within that series. Within James Bond, it's very different. And I think if you were to play with that character's identity by changing his, you know, his ethnicity or his gender, it's not going to be the same character. By all means, if you want to include characters from any walk of life, any racial background, any gender, or any number of genders, you can include them in the series, in the books. But what you can't do is for your main protagonist start messing around with the fundamental things like that. His age and his characteristics. Okay, this is interesting because it affects who can be placed into the Bond role. Now, I recently read or reread the book Moonraker by Ian Fleming. And in that book, it tells us a lot about the backstory of Bond. It's actually my favourite literary Bond book. It's got one of the best villains in Hugo Drax, but it tells us a bit more about James Bond himself and his role. And as a 00 agent, we're led to understand in that book that he is somewhere in his mid-30s, because it tells us that 00 agents have to retire, mandatory, at the age of 45. And it tells us that Bond is around about 8 years away from retirement. And in my mind, Bond is always around about 37 years of age, because that's the age you would need to be to have the maturity and the experience, I think, to to play the role or to be the character that he is in the books. He's also a commander in the Royal Navy, and you'd probably have to be about 37 at the earliest to have achieved the rank of commander in the Royal Navy. It's several rungs up the ladder, even though accepted he's a secret agent, not a naval officer, but you know, to get to that level of seniority, you would probably be in your later 30s. And similarly, physicality. All right, to be physical enough, to be at your physical prime to allow you to do the things that Bond is expected to do as a secret agent, a hitman, a murderer, a killer. You can't be an older chap, you know, with creaking joints and replaced hips. 37 is probably towards the top end of the age where somebody is at their physical halcyon days. So that's why I think that does really reflect on who can take on the role. And from the screen personas that we've seen in the past, almost all of the Bonds have been over 6 feet in height. Sean Connery was 6'2", Roger Moore about 6'1", I believe, Pierce Brosnan about 6'1", Tim Dalton, George Lazenby, they're all over 6 feet. Daniel Craig was the shortest, probably between 5'10", 5'11". So I would imagine any future Bond is going to be a man who is probably 6 feet or over, or maybe a touch less. So it gives us an indication. And I would suggest he needs to be a good-looking character, because in all, and I don't mean that in any sort of, you know, exclusionary way to people who are not traditionally good-looking, but there's normally a romantic element to any Bond story. So, you know, for a start, he's going to be a heterosexual male. You can't really play around with his sexuality, and he needs to be a traditionally good-looking man as well. So that's kind of where I'm going with that. So let us look at some of the characters whose names have been suggested as potential Bonds. Okay, so who have we got first? Aaron Taylor-Johnson. Aaron Taylor-Johnson is a British actor. Okay, good start. He's 33, so he's largely in the area that we're looking for. He is 5 feet 11 inches in height, and he is a classically good-looking fellow, there's no doubt about that. He is most famous for the Kick-Ass movie, or movies, in which he's played, but he's played a number of other roles. He's been in, I think he's played Quicksilver in the Marvel movies, and he often plays in sort of smaller productions. He's not like a big blockbuster actor. He's got the physical appearance, the physicality, I think, that Bond needs to have. And he's the right nationality. He's about the right height. And I think one thing he has going for him is he is not a superstar, all right? He's not associated, other than Kick-Ass, which has been quite a long time ago now, you know, he's not associated with any sort of franchise or run of, you know, characters. He is kind of a name which is predominantly still a little bit unknown. I mean, many people, you might be thinking, who's Aaron Taylor-Johnson? I can't picture him in my mind, even as I use his name. That could be to his advantage, because if you think back, so was Daniel Craig back then. He'd been in a few smaller productions. He wasn't a big star. I think they like actors to be in that category, because if you've got somebody who's a huge star and they're associated with another role, it's hard for us then to, you know, maybe project the Bond character onto that individual. Maybe better to take an actor who is less well known that we can start to think of as Bond from the get-go. So I think that plays into Aaron Taylor-Johnson's favour. I think he's a strong possible Bond. Some of the other characters, Henry Cavill, right? You've mentioned him in your initial conversation here, Daniel. Henry Cavill has long been associated with the Bond name, because I believe he was auditioned for the original role, which Daniel Craig got, but he was considered to be too young because he was in his 20s then. Now, Henry Cavill might have missed his chance, I think, because he's actually 41. Or he's 40 at the moment. He's going to be 41 early next year. Otherwise, he's 6 feet tall. He's British. In fact, he's from the island of Jersey, off the coast of England. And he is without doubt one of the most stylish men in the world. He's without doubt one of the most physically attractive men in the world. You know, he's got all of that going for him. The only things he has going against him is his age, I think, because if they want to get a new Bond character who needs to commit 10 years to the role, because let's be honest, they make these films at such a slow pace now. Once every 4 or 5 years, you're probably only going to get 2 or 3 films out of somebody over 10 years. And I think in 10 years' time, Henry Cavill will have timed out. You know, he'll be over 50, although I'm sure he's going to be in fabulous shape and look just as good, but it's knocking on a bit. You know, even when Dan Craig was in his last film, I think he was over the hill when it comes to age. And they played him as a sort of jaded, older character deliberately to play into that. So Henry Cavill, that might be against him. What also might be against him is the fact he's truly a superstar now. He's an A-list actor, deeply associated with the Superman role, for which he's beloved, and only recently sort of left against his own volition, to a degree. And he is massively associated with Superman, which may go against him with a Bond character, because they might be thinking, excuse me, you know, can we really break people's association with Superman and place him into James Bond with Henry Cavill? So that's one thing. The other thing is his price point. Excuse me, the smoke. His price point is probably going to be a bit high. You know, he's going to be a very expensive James Bond, opposed to somebody like Aaron Taylor-Johnson, who is likely to have a much lower salary point. And these things are taken into account. You know, so I think Henry Cavill, I would love to see him take the role. I think he's the perfect embodiment of Bond, but they would have to cast him now and make that film next year to allow them to get as much time as possible out of him in that role. And the other thing you've got to think about, does he want it? You know, he is so successful now. Would he want to be deeply associated with James Bond and have that flavour the rest of his future? So speeding up, Tom Hardy's been a sort of name associated with Bond. He is British. However, he is 46, he is 5'9" in height. Unfortunately, he's too old, he's a little bit short, and no disrespect to him at all by that, by the way, I'm 5'9", but I just don't think he meets the criteria. James Norton, British actor, 38 years of age, British, 6'1", not really well known, Cambridge educated, not super famous. He's been in lots of TV series, a couple of smaller movies, good looking guy, strawberry blonde, so that would be a first for Bond, but he's got a chance. Tom Hiddleston, 42 years of age, 6'1.5", very British, Cambridge educated again, associated with the Loki character in the Marvel movies, falls into the same category I've talked about. He's over 40, and I just don't think he fits the mould. You know, that's just my observation. Just my observation. So really, if you're going to keep it to British, and I'm looking at the names which have been mentioned, there are not quite so many options available. Now, they might pick somebody we've never heard of, whose name is unknown, who they're going to take from scratch and mould into the character of Bond. And that might be what they're thinking, because it's not going to cost them a lot of money. It's not going to be a high ticket price on their salary. And then we don't have to, you know, divorce ourselves from a previous role that they've played. So, in short, Aaron Taylor-Johnson, I think, for me, is the more likely character, but I would love and prefer to see Henry Cavill, but I think that ship has sailed. I really do. We will see. One thing is for sure, though, Bond will be back. So, there we go, through the smoke. I hope you've enjoyed this video on my observations of Bond, and Daniel, I hope I answered the question for you. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, click the subscribe button. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that by buying me a coffee. You could, what else can you do? You can subscribe, you can even become a patron. And if you become a patron, you will benefit from the additional video content that I produce for my patrons each and every week. So until the next time, take care, and I will see you again very soon.